Hey everybody, welcome back to Hail State Debate, the YouTube channel where us folks here on the Mississippi State Debate team break down all the new high school LD and PF topics each month because we think debate is awesome. We want more people to do it and to have fun with it and to reach their potential. You may have noticed that it is just me here for this particular video. We're shooting it in late December, so Josh and Alicia are at home on a well-deserved holiday break. So unfortunately, you are stuck with just me. Don't worry for the Josh and Alicia fans out there. They will be back for the February video. But for now, we're going to try to muddle through with just me, analyzing and breaking down the January 2019 topic, which is resolve the United States federal government should prioritize reducing the federal debt over promoting economic growth. As always, we want this to be useful to you, so if it is, maybe give us a like, maybe subscribe, maybe tell a friend. As always, the timestamps for the different sections are going to be in the description of the video, and so are the sources that we cite, because remember, there's no substitute for you going and doing your own reading and your own research. That's what makes a good debater. Also, one new announcement, which is that we are now on Twitter. At Hail State Debate. And the idea was we just realized that after we dropped some of these videos, we would find that sometimes we'd have new ideas for arguments, new sources or resources that we would come across. And we don't have the ability to do a new video for those. So we thought having a place where we could put those up online just briefly and say, hey, here's something that we stumbled on. Here's a new idea that we had as the topic progresses would be a good thing. Also, we may look at some other things like voting on topic selections, a few general thoughts on debate. We're not going to blow up your Twitter feed. We're not going to send you pictures of all of our tournaments. That's not what it's for. But, you know, to have some useful supplemental info, 3 or 4 tweets a month maybe, just on the particular topic, maybe give us a follow at Hail State Debate. So, without further ado, my thoughts on this topic. Well, first of all, I think that as a topic area, this is a really, really good one. I think the national debt is important because a lot of times in debate, we look at these policy options and things that we might do in kind of a vacuum, and we don't think about the fact that they all have to fit within a certain amount of money, right? We have a finite amount of money, a finite amount of resources. Nothing's free. Everything costs something. And when you spend more than you take in, which is what we currently do and have done for a long time as a country, there are consequences to that, just like when you do it in your own personal life. And understanding what those consequences are, understanding concepts like interest and debt to GDP ratio. These are important tools for having a larger picture of how policy issues work. So I think it's important, sort of an academic, educational issue, A+, fantastic. But as a specific resolution in terms of how this is framed, it leaves a lot to be desired. I have a fair number of concerns about it. The first thing is it's a little bit outdated in terms of its framing. The idea of reducing the national debt was very much in vogue with, for example, Republicans, a decade ago, during sort of the ascendancy of like Paul Ryan and folks like that. Today, it's very much the opposite. It seems like the impetus for this topic was probably Trump's Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which does exactly the opposite of reducing the debt. It lowers taxes while spending is still going up. So it's interesting that we kind of framed it in the opposite way of where the policy trends tend to be going today. That's okay, no problem. This can be a debate about we should be doing the opposite of what we're currently doing, and that's totally valid. But it's just an interesting way of framing it. A little bit more concerning is the use of the term reducing. Reducing the national debt is a heavier burden from the pro than what most people advocate. Most people, if you look at the literature out there, will tell you that the big problems from a national debt aren't happening right now. They're things that will happen in the future if the national debt grows unchecked. So in a perfect world, the way I might have phrased this resolution was something about constraining the debt or controlling the debt or preventing it from reaching some level in the future, because that's where a lot of the literature is going to say the big problems are. And those are the big harms that ideally the pro would be able to cite. The idea of reducing it means we look at where we are now, we say that the status quo isn't good enough, and we turn the train around and go in the other direction, at least arguably. There are, other ways to come at it, and we're going to talk about that, and it's going to be important for the pro to think about framing the resolution in a way that's a little bit more favorable because of things like this. The biggest concern I have, though, is the idea of prioritizing in the resolution, prioritizing the reduction of debt versus economic growth. And I think this is potentially a big barrier if pro teams aren't thoughtful about it, because basically, the core argument that most proponents of debt reduction make is that in the long run, reducing the debt will spur economic growth that would not have happened without the debt reduction going on. So if you make that argument, and most pros are going to have to run an argument that says in the long run this is better for the economy, well, the con, any good con, is going to turn around and say, well, then if you're saying that, if you're saying we reduce the debt in order to have economic growth, then you're really not prioritizing one over the other. You're just sort of saying, let's do both. Right. And that is a legitimate concern. It's something that other people have identified already in analyzing the topic. It's something that comes up in the academic literature, that you try to do both. So that's a real concern for the pro and something you're going to have to be thoughtful about. I do think there are ways around it. I do think it's going to require a little bit of thought on the front by pro teams, but it can be done. So basically my thoughts are A+ topic area, C- phrasing of the resolution, but that's okay. That's what we're here to help with. The pro has its work cut out for it, but we can do it. And we're going to get started right now. So the order will be, first we're going to have an overview of the general concepts, which is to say some basic ideas so we're all speaking the same language about this very kind of complex, nuanced topic with a lot of stuff built into it. Second, we're going to look at definitions, framework. Third, pro arguments. Fourth, con arguments, and then we'll wrap up with some final thoughts. So without further ado, we will get started in just 1 second. Okay, so it goes without saying that this is a topic with a lot of fairly complex terminology and concepts packed into it. It's deep, it's nuanced, there's a lot of stuff to learn. Deficits, debts, interest rates, debt to GDP ratio, these are all things that you're going to have to understand to be able to defend your position. And these terms, in turn, build into larger discussions that involve, frankly, math and economics. You guys are too young to remember the joke from Saturday Night Live with Gerald Ford saying, "I was told there would be no math." Well, suffice to say, there will be math. So sorry if that's not your thing. And if you don't dive into it, you're going to have a tough time. Because look, there are tons of beautiful pre-written block quotes from these interest groups on both sides, from these economists and authors on both sides, great stats, and you can go in and read a beautiful case, frankly, with a lot of pre-written stuff, and you don't really even have to know a whole lot about what you're talking about. And you might beat some, average teams like that. The problem is when you run into good teams who do know what they're talking about, who do understand these concepts and these underlying assumptions. If you don't understand what they're talking about when they explain why, for example, interest rates mean that the debt is not a problem. If you don't get that, right, then there's not going to be much you can say when they attack those beautiful sources that you're citing. So it's really important that you know what you're talking about beyond just the stuff you're reading. So to avoid you being in a bad position and to put you in a stronger position, what we're going to do this time is a little bit different. We're going to start by covering two general concept areas. First, we're going to talk about what the national debt is, how it happens, who owns it, just basic vocabulary to make sure we're speaking the same language, right, to get started. And then secondly, once we've done that, we're going to talk about the basic core economic and philosophical arguments about why debt can be a good tool for a country, and then the arguments about why it potentially can become a serious problem. So at the very, 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 very beginning, a debt is an amount of money that you borrow from someone that you promise to pay back in the future, usually with something called interest, which is an additional amount that you pay them for the privilege of using their money. And we'll talk about all of that in just a second. But for now, the national debt, or as we call it in this resolution, the federal debt, just to be particular that this is the federal government's debt, not like the states or local governments. The national debt is the amount of money the federal government owes to various creditors. And when we say creditors, all we mean is the people we owe money to. That's what a creditor is. So how much do we owe? Well, the answer is about $21 trillion, or 21 million dollars. Just to make it clear how much a trillion is, it's a lot of money. That's according to the U.S. National Debt Clock, which cites to the Office of Management and Budget. By the way, the Debt Clock website is probably the single most important resource on this resolution. It is a fantastic, literally a single page website that just shows the debt in real time. But more than just that, it has dozens of other neat little breakdowns of statistics. Things like debt to GDP ratio, things like interest payments, things like where this money is going, projections for the future, comparisons to the past, all right there in one like dashboard on the screen. It's not going to tell you everything you need to know because it's just numbers. But once you start to get these concepts in your head about, okay, here's what we're arguing about, going back to that Debt Clock website. Heck, if you're in one of these leagues that's moved to allow now using the internet in rounds, maybe doing a fun little thing where you go and look and say, right now, the national debt, maybe not, I don't know. But using it in your preparation to get the actual numbers, it's fantastic. So make sure you go take a look at it. A better way, a more valid way of looking at it is what's called the debt to GDP ratio, comparing our debt to the gross domestic product. Gross domestic product, or GDP, is just the amount of all the goods and services that the United States produces in a year. All the services, all the goods, all the manufacturing, public sector, private sector, everything we consume, right? Right now, the United States GDP is currently about $20.8 trillion a year. It's a huge, huge amount of money. But as you've noticed, the debt is actually a little bit more than that. It's about 103 or 105% of what we produce in a year. So literally, we would have to produce for an entire year and not consume it. We'd starve to death. We couldn't do it, right, to pay off the debt. And that ratio is what people worry about a lot. It's not the absolute amount of money. It's the fact that the debt is getting bigger than the amount that we produce in a year that has a lot of people concerned. Also, remember that the GDP is everything. It's the public sector and the private sector. When we talk about government spending, it's actually lower than that, right? So the government spends about, all governments, federal, state, and local in the United States, again, I think this is according to OMB, spends about $7.1 trillion a year, which means the debt that the federal government owes is about 3 times what all governments in the U.S. spend in a year. So it's basically 3 years worth of government spending now that we owe. And when you start to think about, man, we owe 3 years worth of this spending that we have yet to pay, it's just a debt to somebody, that begins to feel on a gut level a little troubling. Other ways of framing it, for example, looking at the debt clock again, the debt per citizen is $66,000. So right now, you, as your per capita share of the national debt, even though you're probably not a taxpayer yet, you already owe $66,000 as your contribution. If you are a taxpayer, because not everyone is, your share is, if you divide it that way, $178,000, which is a huge amount of money. And let me say, by the way, especially for the pro has some disadvantages in terms of framing, but one big advantage it has is these numbers are astronomical. And your judges in a lot of cases will be lay people. They may know a good bit about debt because they may have to deal with it in their own lives, but saying $178,000 per taxpayer, that's a gut level impact. Kind of like on the pharmaceutical resolution, we encourage you to mention these personal stories about people who couldn't afford their pharmaceuticals. Well, don't neglect, especially if you're the pro, to emphasize how crazy it is that every single person is born owing $66,000. So, it seems like it's really bad. How does the United States compare to other countries, though, when it comes to debt? Well, it depends on where you look. So if we look to more similar fully developed countries, we actually see that they have similar debt loads, right? If we look at the UK, theirs is 90.4%, Canada's is 89%, France is 98%, Germany is lower at 64%, but still 64% is not trivial. So when we look at these other countries, we begin to get the first idea that maybe even though 105% debt to GDP ratio sounds like we owe a lot of money, and we do, maybe it's not the end of the world, because these other countries have similar loads of debt. Their economies are not collapsing. They're not defaulting on the debt. They continue to be able to borrow and get credit from creditors. So maybe it's not the end of the world. In fact, we look at some countries and they're far worse than the United States. Greece, for example, has a debt to GDP ratio of 177%. Now, they've gone through a massive financial and fiscal crisis in that country because of overspending, so that's understandable. Look at Japan. Japan leads the world with a debt to GDP ratio of 223%. That's astronomical. And even though Japan's economy is slow, it's certainly not as dynamic as it was in the 1980s and 1990s. It's not collapsing either, and they have more than double the load that we do in comparison to their GDP. So that might be your first clue that this is not as bad as it seems, and debt to GDP ratio is a way you can compare apples to apples from different countries, so it's important. But anyway, even if it's not the end of the world, right, it is a lot of money. So who do we owe this money to? Well, actually, first, let's ask, why do we owe so much money, right? And the short answer to that is the same reason anybody owes money. We want to spend stuff before we earn stuff. We want Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, a huge military, the biggest in the world, social programs, robust government agencies. We want all these things, but what we don't want to do is we don't want to raise taxes to the level that would be necessary to pay as we go. Right? We don't want to pay taxes on a European level for the spending that we do. We just, politically, we reject it. The OMB estimates that total U.S. revenues for fiscal year 2019, in other words, all the stuff the government takes in taxes, will be about $3.4 trillion, while spending will be $4.2 trillion, which will leave a deficit of just under $800 billion. And when we say deficit, what we mean is in any given year, how far do we fall short? In other words, our tax revenues fall short of what we want to spend and what we need to spend. So the deficit happens in a particular year. That's how far we fall short. And then we just stack those on top of the existing debt each year, and the deficits add up to the debt. Right? Now, as we're going to talk about in just a few minutes, it might be necessary to spend like this in a recession. Like John Maynard Keynes, the great economist, would say, if you do deficit spending and spend more than you take in a recession, it'll get the economy going and help you bring out of it. But we're not in a recession, right? We're not. We're actually, the economy is doing really well. And yet, our deficit, the amount that we're falling short, is actually 17% higher than it was in 2017. And that's really scary because we've got a healthy, strong economy, which means in a healthy, strong economy, you would think we would be able to pay taxes, generate tax revenues, and pay for stuff. It's like if you got a big raise at work, right? And not only were you not able to pay for all the stuff you had, you're actually falling farther and farther and farther behind in debt, even though you just got a big raise at work, which is what the United States has done. We have a robust economy that should have us bringing in more taxes because people are making more, and yet we're falling farther and farther and farther behind. The debt's getting bigger and bigger, and that's why people are scared, because it's not that this is just a one-time thing. This is an ongoing thing. So the next question is, who do we owe this money to? Who do we owe it to? And the answer is just about everybody. Sometimes when you're young, if you haven't really heard of the national debt, you think it's just like one country owes money to another. Like the United States owes money to China. And of course we do owe money to China. That does happen. But only about 6 trillion of the 21 trillion we owe actually is held by foreign countries, or about 30%. In addition to that, you have foreign and domestic investors, individuals, companies, pension funds, banks, insurance companies, private individuals. The federal government even owes money to itself. Like when one agency like the Social Security Trust Fund is taking in more than it needs at a given time, it will actually loan money back to the Treasury. So the part of the government owes money back to the main Treasury, right? And so you might ask, well, how do all these people get this debt? What do they do? And the answer is, well, if you wanted to borrow money, you would go to a bank, right? You'd ask for a loan. But of course, there's no bank big enough to lend to the United States government. So instead, the way the United States does it is the Treasury will sell things called Treasury bills, notes, and bonds. These are called like Treasury securities, or just treasuries in the common parlance. And these are basically just legal promises to pay back the money. They are selling debt like an instrument of debt, right? You buy a certificate. It says the government owes me this much money. And anybody can do it. If you've got $100 in change, you can go out and buy this federal debt. The interest rate on the debt is really, really important. Because remember, we said earlier that when you take out any sort of debt, you're going to have to pay for the right to use that money. It's not free, right? The principal is the amount that you borrow, right? So for example, if you borrowed $100 in principal with an interest rate of 3%, you pay back $103. The interest rate is 3%, and that's how much you pay back. And really, interest is sort of the crux of the problem when it comes to the national debt, because when you think about it, if you just had to pay back the amount that you borrowed, that wouldn't be the end of the world, right? I mean, if you borrow $1 billion and then you pay it back later, well, you might be a little behind in terms of where you need to be in bringing in the revenue, but you haven't lost anything. You haven't paid anything that you wouldn't have otherwise paid. The problem is when you pay interest, that interest is gone. That's the amount you pay to the borrower, whether it's the Chinese government or a pension fund or whoever. You pay them that money at the end of the time for the bond or the bill or whatever, and it's gone. You don't get to spend it on social programs. You don't get to spend it on the military. You just have to make those interest payments for nothing. That is total loss to the government. Just like if you're paying interest on a student debt, that is total loss to you. You never get to use that money. And the interest payments on the debt are a big problem. According to the CBO, in 2018, the U.S. paid $371 billion on interest alone. That's not the principal, that's just the interest on the debt. And that's up $60 billion from the previous year. It's over half of what we spent on our entire massive military budget, which is about $600 billion, right? It's about the same as what we spend on Medicaid, which is one of our largest entitlement programs. And the idea is if we keep spending more and more and more money on these interest payments. We take out more debt, we have to pay more interest. They choke off more and more of the revenue that we could spend on things like Medicare and Social Security. And it becomes a sort of circular thing, right? It gets worse and worse. In fact, according to the CBO, by 2028, we'll be spending twice as much after inflation on these interest payments, and it'll be choking off more of our federal revenue. And it's going to continue to get worse. And there is absolutely a point at which it has to stop. So an analogy would be like, for example, if you owed like a lot in credit card debt and you couldn't get through your monthly expenses, and your solution to that was to go out and take out a payday loan from one of these shady payday loan places, all right? And then it gets you through the month, right? That's what we're doing. We're borrowing to pay to get through the month. But then the next month, you not only owe for your expenses that you couldn't meet and the credit card, you also now have a payday loan to pay off. You bring in more and more debt. It leads to more and more interest. That interest eats up more and more of your economy, and you end up having to pay more and more, borrow more and more to continue going. And so that's the big concern, which is that these interest payments are eating up a bigger and bigger chunk of our federal revenue, and that's one of the big issues. And that actually is a really good segue to the next thing we need to talk about, which is what are the basic arguments about why national debt is bad versus why it might be good. Okay, so really quickly, what are the basic historical arguments for and against debt that economists use? Why are we having this discussion? Well, for a long time, the idea of government debt was a function of the theories of John Maynard Keynes, one of the most famous economists of all time. And we could talk about him for days, but we don't really have time. Suffice it to say, Keynes's theory was when you're in a depression or in a recession, the government should go out and borrow money because it's hard to tax people a lot of money in a recession. And it should spend it on government projects and things like that just to get the money out into the economy, get it in people's pockets, get workers working so that they can go out and buy stuff, stores open back up, people invest. The idea is to spur the economy. And it proved, there's a debate about it. We'll include some links. We'll actually include a really interesting rap battle between Keynes and F.A. Hayek, just for fun, just to give you a sense of how this works in the links below. But basically it worked for this purpose. The problem is that's not really why we're adding to the debt today. We're not in a recession, right? We were back in 2008 and 2009. We did do deficit spending. We did add to the debt back then. It did help us get out of it. That's fine. That's a totally legitimate debate. But today the economy is good, right? So why are we still lowering taxes and raising spending and adding to the debt today? That's the reason we're having this debate on this particular topic. And the real reason we do debt today, if we want to be totally honest about it, is why not? We can afford it, so the argument goes, right? I mean, yes, the debt is a lot of money, but we make the debt payments, don't we? I mean, interest rates, remember we said all these treasuries that we sell, these loans that we take out through treasuries have interest rates. Well, those interest rates by historical standards are quite low. They're very, very low, which means that the market, the people who loan us money, the countries that loan us money, these institutions, they think we're good for it. They think we can make these payments, and we can, right? We do make them. And it allows us to have things like Medicaid for the poor, Medicare for retirees, Social Security for retirement, a military that is the best in the world, all of these agencies that spend on education and on the environment and all of these things. They also pump money into the economy when we give senior citizens back their Social Security checks that they've paid in for. They spend it on stuff and it keeps the economy humming. In other words, we want all this stuff. And look, we can pay for it. Do we have to take out a loan? Yeah, but we're making the payments. So why not? It improves people's quality of life and there's no great catastrophe. So really, while some teams might try to argue spurring the economy as a reason to have debt, the truth is that's not really why we're doing it. We're not in a recession where we would need to do that. The reason we're doing it is because we can. We want more stuff for people and we can pay for it because we have a huge amount of debt, but we make the payments on time. The interest rates are low. So basically the rationale is why not? And so it's not truly a Keynesian argument. It's more of it's a quality of life thing. And there's no reason to stop now because things seem to be going okay. On the other side, the basic core argument against the debt is a phrase called Stein's law. It comes from a guy named Herb Stein, who's a conservative economist, and his law is very simple. If something can't go on forever, it won't, right? And if you look at the debt that we're taking on every year, even in good times, we're adding not only to the debt, But more importantly, we're adding to the interest payments. Remember, we talked about earlier how a huge portion of our federal budget is now taken up with interest payments on the debt. And remember, the interest is the money we pay for nothing, right? The debt principal is just us paying back what we actually spent on stuff like the military and Social Security. The interest is what we pay for absolutely nothing, right? And that number is getting bigger and bigger. $377, I think, billion dollars. That's over 10% of our actual tax revenues, right? It's a very high percentage of our entire budget. And within a decade, it's going to be 20% of our actual tax revenues, according to projections, and it's going to continue to go up. And there's a point at which that's going to have to stop. Obviously, if it were 100% of our tax revenues, then we can't have a government anymore, right? But long before then, when you start seeing these interest payments stack up to 25, 30, 40%, 50%, when we're paying half of our income for nothing, you're going to see a really, really serious problem. The government's not going to be able to function in the way that it does right now. You're not going to be able to have this huge military, all these robust social programs like Medicare, Medicaid, education spending. You're going to have to stop. And the real problem is we know that day of reckoning is coming. It's a matter of math. If you spend more than you bring in, there's going to come a time at which you have to stop and spend less than you bring in, right? Eventually. Now, you might be able to continue for a year or 2 years, or if your economy is growing, 100 years. You could go for a long time. But eventually, if we keep doing what we're doing now, which is growing the debt year by year, growing the interest year by year, there's going to just mathematically come a point at which we have to stop. And this is the key point for the pro. The longer we wait, the worse it's going to be, right? If we had started addressing this 10 years ago, we could have very slowly brought our spending down, very slowly brought our taxes up, met in the middle, and had less of an impact on the economy. But if you wait until the day on which we actually are spending 30 or 40% of our tax revenues on these interest payments, well, then it's gonna be like slamming into a brick wall. You're gonna have to massively cut Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, the military. Not only will that affect the poor, not only will that affect vulnerable people, it will also have a huge negative impact in the economy. You'll be raising taxes. That'll have a negative impact on the economy. Taking dollars out of people's pockets from things like Social Security, God forbid, less money for them to spend. You will send the economy into a massive recession because you will be lowering spending, taking money out, and raising taxes, taking money out, and you'll have no choice. So one of the basic arguments the pro can make is there's never going to be a better time to do this now, to hit the brakes, because there is a brick wall out there somewhere. We're not there yet. We could keep driving along at 80 miles an hour, no problem, except we know there's a brick wall. And if we wait until we're right in front of the brick wall, we're probably going to smash into it, right? Or at least it's going to be really, really hard and painful to stop. So the basic argument is it's going to have to stop at some point, and this is the least dangerous, least bad, least damaging time for it to stop. So those are the two basic overarching theories, kind of in a nutshell. Now let's move on to actually start applying this to the resolution and talk about how we can stake out some better positions in terms of definitions and framework. Okay, so when it comes to definitions and framework, I think the single most important thing we need to start out talking about is the idea of what it means to prioritize reduction of the debt over economic growth. Like we said earlier, prioritizing two interrelated things can be a complicated, messy linguistic thing, especially for the pro if you don't think about it carefully. So what I've done is I've asked our production assistant, Sam, to put together a sequence to get us a real expert on just like keeping things straightforward and simple. So he went out and got us somebody who's really good at this stuff to sort of keep things simple. You got that for us?
Yeah, right here.
So what's this?
That is an expert explaining the topic very simply.
Okay, fantastic. Well, listen, thanks very much. We'll just go ahead and get started with that now then.
If the reason you do thing A is to accomplish thing B, it really doesn't make sense to talk about prioritizing thing A over thing B. For example, if you need to get in your car to go to the grocery store, are you prioritizing getting in the car because you do that first, or going to the grocery store because that's the final objective? It turns into an argument about what the word prioritize means, sort of like which came first, the chicken or the egg. And that's no fun for anybody.
And, I mean, basically, that's right. I mean, the terms economic growth and debt reduction are inextricably related, right? Because every single pro, if they're using the evidence, if they're citing the literature, is going to have to argue that cutting the debt is a prerequisite to avoiding long-term economic catastrophe, right? To avoid the United States plunging into a depression when we can't pay our debts or when our debts become more expensive, right? So in other words, reducing the debt is a prerequisite to long-term economic growth as opposed to long-term economic collapse. The problem is if you say that, right, which most people will, and you go with a sort of traditional definition of prioritize, which is just to say that one is more important than the other, one is a bigger deal than the other, well, then any con team worth its salt is going to say, okay, fair enough, let's take you at your word. Let's say it will avoid this economic collapse. You're not prioritizing one over the other. You're just saying, let's do both. Let's address the debt and let's also have economic growth. There's no prioritizing there. And it becomes a really messy round that you don't want to be in. And by the way, that's not just a common sense argument, right? That it's hard to prioritize one over the other. That has support in the literature. You can look to, for example, economist Alice Rivlin of the Brookings Institute back in 2013 had this congressional testimony that basically said, look, you can't reduce the debt. You can't address the deficit without economic growth. They go hand in hand. So this is an argument that has a lot of support. And frankly, if I were the con, I would even think, as we'll talk later, about kind of building my case around not necessarily saying, we don't care about the debt, but rather saying you have to do both together. You can't prioritize one over the other. But regardless, the con will have you in a difficult spot if you're just talking about what's more important. That's why I would suggest, and I think the only really tactically adequate way of coming at this from the pro is to define prioritize as the sequential order that you go in. In other words, when do you do it? When do we do a reduction of the debt first, or do we do economic growth first in time? There obviously are good dictionary definitions for this. The Cambridge Dictionary says prioritize can mean to arrange in order of importance so that you can deal with the most important things first. The Oxford English Dictionary says sequence of order due to things relative importance. So there's tons of good definitions. You can also defend this if you have to in a definition fight by saying, look, this gives you, judge, a clean basis. Prioritizing about importance is messy. It becomes circular. It leads to a linguistic debate as opposed to a debate about issues. If you go with order, it gives you a clean-cut way to make the decision. It's more educational because it forces us to talk about the issues rather than what the word prioritize means. So there's a really good way to defend the idea of going in sequence, right? And when you do that, right, you actually, I think, take the high ground away from the con. You get a little bit of an advantage as a pro, right? Because look, it's really very simple. The deficit, which builds into the debt, right, is growing at an astronomical rate. In 2018, it grew by 17%, even in a good economy. This year, in 2019, CBO is projecting that it's going to be well over 20% thanks to the Trump tax cut bill. Now, if you compare that to our rate of economic growth, right, our rate of economic growth is 3%, right, compared to 20% growth in the deficit. It doesn't take a mathematician to see that if the economy is growing at 3% and the debt is growing at 20%, you're never going to catch up with economic growth because, economic growth caps out at around maybe 5 or 6%. And that would be a really overheated economy. I mean, even when China was just blowing things out of the water during its rapid ascent from basically poverty into a developed economy, even then you were talking about 10% growth. So you're never going to see 17 or 20% growth. There is no way to grow yourself out of this hole that you're digging deeper and deeper and deeper with this growing deficit. So there's just mathematically no way. So first thing we have to do, right? And we agree completely. They're both very important in terms of their long-term importance. But the first thing we have to do is we have to go in and take steps to raise taxes, reduce spending, and get this growth of the deficit in line with what our actual economic growth is. Because if we don't, it's, we basically got like a hole in the side of the boat, right? And we're bailing water out with economic growth at a rate of about 3% a year, which is really good. That's a good growing economy at 3%. But we're adding 20% more water every single year. And ultimately, it's just a matter of math. We can't catch up with this deficit just growing the economy. There's no way to grow an economy that fast. So the first thing we have to do is we have to get that deficit under control, and then we can absolutely look at economic growth, and we will have more economic growth in the long run. But it really just becomes a matter of math. Now, for the con, you're just fine with the idea of talking about relative importance, right? In terms of not looking at sequence. If you're the con and the pro doesn't define prioritize, you might just drop a quick definition and say, prioritize means what's more important, and then just go to town. I mean, go ahead and let it be a confusing debate where you keep coming in and saying, how can you say one is more important than the other when you have to do both and you have to have both? You're totally fine with that. And as we'll see later, there are even ways that the con can argue about which you should do both, citing some of this evidence that you have to do both debt reduction and economic growth at the same time. But if you're the pro, it is imperative that you make an argument about sequence as opposed to relative importance. I think that's the only way to cleanly win around on this, and it gives you a tremendous advantage because it just makes it a math fight where you show that the rate of growth in the deficit is so high that the economy could never catch up to it. So before we do anything else, we got to plug the hole in the side of the boat and address the problem of the debt, and then we can turn and look to economic growth, because there's no way we can catch up by doing growth first. Okay, so next, and this may be the single most important thing we talk about, so stay with me. What does it mean to say reducing the federal debt? Okay, this is a really, really key issue because most of the evidence about why debt is harmful assumes that we continue in this upward trajectory towards some nightmare scenario where it gets really, really high. Most of the really bad things that we talk about with the debt aren't happening now, right? It isn't really causing, for example, an economic collapse. Interest rates are still very low. Remember, the interest rates are how much we have to pay to get the debt, right? So even though we're stacking up a lot of interest, the market still thinks we'll be able to pay for it, and we are able to pay for it, and we do it every single year. So a lot of the worst stuff out there isn't happening right now, which is bad for the pro, right? Also, even worse for the pro is if by reducing we mean we actually have to reduce the dollar amount of the debt. Like it's currently at 21 trillion and we have to go down from there. We have to lower it below 21 trillion. That's even worse for the pro, and it's borderline impossible. And let me explain what I mean. We're currently running an annual deficit of about almost $800 billion, and we're projected to rise to about $1 trillion within a couple of years. So if reducing means pro, you actually have to reduce the total number, the debt number. That means you have to erase that deficit completely and then run at least a small surplus. Remember, because the only way the debt goes down is if we're bringing in more than we spend. So you're going to have to wipe out between $800 billion and $1 trillion within whatever time frame is agreed on in the round, like within a couple of years. And that's, borderline impossible, right? As the New York Times told us in 2015, you can try to do it with tax increases, right? But even the big, sort of high profile, semi-realistic but aggressive tax increases on the rich are probably only going to get you something in the neighborhood of about $350 billion. So where's the remaining $500 billion to $650 billion that we're going to have to come from if we're actually going to start reducing the actual number on the debt below 21 trillion? Well, maybe you could cut all military spending, because that's how much it would cost. Or you could cut all Medicare for the elderly and some Medicaid for the poor. Or you could cut all education spending, transportation system spending, and all veterans benefits. Those are the kind of draconian, massive spending cuts you'd have to do if you wanted to reduce the number in absolute terms. This is exactly what the con wants you to do. Right? This is the slam on the brakes, hurt the poor, kill the economy scenario. This is what's called austerity. This is what you see, for example, in places like Greece that have no choice, right? They run into a public debt that they can't pay, and you have to have huge tax increases which slow the economy, major spending cuts which hurt the poor, and basically all of Kahn's strongest literature is here. And Kahn is going to come in, and if you do this, and they're rightly going to say, whoa, let's be reasonable. Let's focus on economic growth. And instead of cutting the debt or reducing the debt, let's just kind of cap it. Let's just stop it where it is. Maybe even have it grow at a slow rate, just a little bit. And let's just try to grow our way out of this gradually over time. And if you cede that ground to them, if you agree, yes, I'm the pro, I have to reduce it below 21 trillion, you're going to be in a really, really bad place. So thank you for staying with me. All of that to say, the pro needs to look at whether there's a way to define reducing in a way that doesn't require us to slam on the brakes and literally reduce the dollar amount of the debt. And fortunately, there is. And this is something you need to do in the round and focus on in the round. When you look at real world debt reduction plans, they don't say we're going to have less in actual dollars. We're going to go back to $18 trillion because that's impossible. In an economy that's growing every year, even if the debt as a percentage of GDP, debt to GDP ratio went down over time, the number would still go up. Right? So when you look at real world debt reduction plans, right? For example, the Simpson-Bowles plan and the Bipartisan Policy Center Task Force plan, they don't talk about reducing the number of the debt. They talk about cutting the debt to GDP ratio's growth. In other words, reducing the growth of the debt to GDP ratio over time. That's what debt reduction is in the real world. And so that's why the pro needs to think about defining it as not reducing the dollar amount, but reducing the growth of the debt to GDP ratio. Because when you look out on the horizon, right, that's where the real problems are. The CBO projects that by 2048, with current spending levels and current economic growth and current taxation levels, we're going to have a debt that rises to 152% of GDP and is $100 trillion, right? 5 times what it is now. And that's where the nightmare scenarios happen, right? That's where you can find good literature that says the interest rates will rise. Our debt payments will choke off our ability to pay for other things. Default will become realistic. U.S. power will drop in the world because we're not credible economically, right? And it becomes really important. I have a chart here, right, about kind of this no man's land, right? So you have the current level of 21 trillion here, and if you go below that, clearly that's pro territory, right? But it's really hard to go below that. And then you look out on the horizon of this $100 trillion with 152% of GDP, and obviously if it's more than that, then clearly the con has won, because clearly you're saying, just forget about the debt. It doesn't matter. It can be anything. Let's grow the economy, right? The question is, who wins in this territory in between, right? Who wins if the debt total goes above $21 trillion, but we slow down the growth of the debt to GDP ratio so it doesn't reach this nightmare scenario? So for example, hypothetically, if we were to say we had a $66 trillion debt in 2048 under, you can't run a plan, but under one of these policy proposals or whatever, which is something like what they say, our debt to GDP ratio is still about 100%. Maybe it's a little bit less. So the absolute number is a little higher. The GDP ratio is a little bit lower. Whose territory is that? And the pro needs to argue it's ours, because what reduction means and what reduce means in the context of the debt is reducing the rate of growth of the debt to GDP ratio. That's a realistic policy proposal interpretation. If you don't run it that way, you're basically in slam on the brakes world where you have to do austerity and you're in a really bad way. Now, Khan, on the other hand, also wants to claim this territory, because Khan certainly doesn't want to be in this $100 trillion plus, 152% plus world. That's their nightmare scenario, right? That's where they have real problems. So they're going to want to say, look, pro, I'm sorry. I know it's tough for you, but the resolution says what it says. It doesn't say slow the rate of growth. It doesn't say reduce the rate of growth. It says reduce the federal debt. And that might be difficult for you, but everybody has to debate both sides, right? You have to show us we need to go below 21 trillion, and then Khan just needs to be loaded for bear with, evidence, and it's out there, and we'll talk about it later, about how catastrophic that would be. So determining what reduce means, does it mean slow the rate of growth of the debt to GDP ratio, or does it mean cut the actual amount? You need to be ready to fight on that, because that is basically what's going to decide which set of evidence you get to use. The evidence where we've got to do this to avoid this nightmare scenario, right? And now is the best possible time to do it, and we can do it gradually, but we have to start now because now is the best time, now is the least difficult time. Or on the other hand, you have to do total austerity, right? And that's the basic fight that you have to be prepared to win. And if you're not, you can talk past each other, you can read good evidence, but if people understand this dynamic of winning this middle territory, right, they're going to beat people who don't, right, who sort of cede it. If they have a narrative of this middle territory belongs to us, let me show you why we easily win it, you're going to have a huge advantage. So that's just a really, really important thing to bear in mind. Okay, so that's basically it for definitions and framework. Sorry it took so long, but hopefully you can see why I was concerned about the framing of the wording of the resolution. it leaves a little bit of ambiguity as to sort of who owns what terrain. And if you're not ready to address those issues, you can find yourself in a bad position, because there's tons of good cards and good evidence and good impacts out there on both sides, which we're just about to talk about now. But if you're not aware of exactly what the terrain looks like and what you have to win in terms of definitions and framing, you can find your really great evidence either completely irrelevant or at least badly outweighed, just depending on whether or not you're ready to have those discussions. So now, without further ado, let's move on and let's talk about some pro arguments.
Okay, so let's start with the pro. And the question is, how are we going to do this? And the answer is we're going to tell a story, right? Because all of this economic data and all these numbers and concepts are going to get really messed up and bungled around in sort of the mind of the judge unless you tell a straightforward story. And the good news is there is a story you can tell, and it's one that's been told many, many times in the past in the real world and in fiction. And the story goes like this. There's an impending disaster looming on the horizon, and it is absolutely apocalyptic in scope. Some people deny that it exists, others ignore it and want to focus on present problems, but there are those of us who are awake and know that this crisis exists on the horizon and know that it will destroy us. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but make no mistake, winter is coming. Right? And when it gets here, it's going to wreak devastation on us if we do nothing. So you can see, this could be Game of Thrones. This could be, winter is coming. It could be Lord of the Rings. Mordor is coming. If you've ever played Mass Effect, the Reapers, the aliens are coming. It's the same story, right? There's a crisis out there that is inevitably coming and we have to do something about it. But the story goes, there is good news. A solution exists. And the solution will be challenging and there will be trade-offs, but the longer we wait, the harder it will be. And after a certain point, the solution is going to become impossible. So we have to act now. But if we act now and everyone pulls together, we can avoid this catastrophe and preserve the future for ourselves and our children. And that's the story you're telling. So let's be specific about how we're going to tell this story to keep the judge engaged and to understand this complex issue, right? The first thing you're going to need is the proper framing, which we talked about back in the previous section. We talked about understanding what it means to prioritize and what it means to reduce the debt, which we mean is reducing the debt to GDP ratio and the growth of the debt to GDP ratio. You've got to set that up for this to make sense, right? But if you do, then what you need is two more things. First, you need the nightmare scenario of what happens if we don't address the growth of the debt. And then secondly, you need a realistic solution that is not a plan, but it is a realistic solution that you can present, okay? So what is our nightmare scenario? Well, fortunately, it's been laid out for us by the most credible source possible, and that is the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO. They are the gold standard for nonpartisan, bipartisan information about budget issues, right? And CBO has basically said in its projections that if we get to 2048 and we don't change the trajectory that we're on with debt to GDP ratio, a bunch of really bad things are going to happen, right? Our interest payments as a percentage of our spending would quadruple. Right now, our interest payments eat up about 8% of our budget, right? They're going to eat up over 30% by 2048, which means that right at the beginning, we're going to shave off 30% of what we pay in taxes, right? And we're going to pay it for nothing. We're going to pay it for interest. It's going to be gone. That is the equivalent of all of our military spending and all of our Medicare spending put together. It's the equivalent of all of our Social Security spending. This would be absolutely catastrophic and disastrous for the budget. We couldn't spend on national security. We couldn't spend on social programs that people need. That'd be really bad. Second, they say that interest rates would go way, way up. Specifically, they say they'd go from about 2.2% today to 4.4%. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot until you realize that's doubling the amount of money we have to pay for every dollar of debt that we borrow. But even worse than that, because that's what that's going to do is that's going to accelerate the problem even further in the future. So if it's bad in 2048 and then interest rates go dramatically up, it's going to get even worse and worse in the future, right? It's going to cost even more to get this debt. But even worse, remember when interest rates for government treasuries go up, remember all of our other debts in society, mortgages, car loans, student loans, the interest rates on these things are all tied to the rate for government debt. They're all going to be a little bit higher than the rate for government debt because if banks could lend to the government, they would, because even in a bad situation, the government's usually good for it. So if the rate of interest for treasuries, for government debt goes up, well then, and there's tons of sources on this, the rates for mortgages are going to go up and the rates for student loans are going to go up and the rates for car loans are going to go up, which means that every single person in society is going to start paying thousands of dollars more for nothing, right? Just paying it to the bank, not to the government in taxes. We will have to do that, right? But in addition to that, paying more to the bank just in interest payments, which is going to slow down the economy, right? It would constrain our ability to respond to crises, according to the CBO, like recessions and wars. We'd have less leeway to do things there. It would reduce private economic growth because of interest rates, because of taxation, right? It would basically just be a disaster scenario. Now, leaving behind the CBO projections, which are, again, I think the best possible nonpartisan projections you're going to get as the pro, the real end game for what this nightmare scenario looks like has already happened in another country, and that's Greece. If you look at Greece's fiscal and financial crisis, they had a debt to GDP ratio of about 175%. Now, they had to respond. They hit the wall. They made it to their 2048. For them, it was a couple of years ago, right? They made it to their nightmare scenario where they didn't have the ability to slow things down over the long run, right? And what did they have to do? Well, they had to cut public employee wages by 20%, cut pensions for the elderly by thousands of dollars a month, raise property taxes, cut subsidies for heating fuel, and fire over 5% of the entire government workforce. And even though they did all of those things, what happened to their economy? Well, you got to hold on to your seat for this because the numbers are absolutely amazing. When they hit this debt wall out there on the horizon, they saw their GDP fall from 352 billion a year to 195 billion. Their GDP was almost cut in half, with annual growth rates that reached negative 10%. And the basic message is that's what we as the pro are trying to prevent, right? We're trying to avoid this nightmare austerity scenario where we don't have any more time to fix the problem. We run into the wall. And the worst problem is, even if we got into that Greek scenario where everything just goes completely wrong for us, we still have to address the debt. It would still be there, and we'd still have to start reducing it. Only instead of doing it with 8% of our budget tied behind our back in interest payments, we'd be doing it with 30% of our budget tied behind our back. And instead of 2% interest rates, doing it with 4%. And instead of doing it with a strong economy, doing it with a weak economy. Eventually, as a matter of math, we are going to have to rein in this growth. There's no way to avoid it, right? And so what you have to do is you have to say, but don't worry, there are realistic scenarios to fix this. Now, remember, as the pro, you don't have the ability to propose a plan, but that's actually kind of a good thing here because it gives you a little flexibility. You're going to say, look, we can't offer you a specific plan. We're not allowed to do that by rule, but what we can do is we can tell you that there's a half dozen different viable, well-regarded, published suggestions and proposals from research groups and from legislators and things like that about how we can reduce the debt to GDP ratio. There's the Simpson-Bowles plan. There's the Dominic Rivlin plan. There's the Solutions Initiative 2 plan. And all of these basically have some combination of, we're going to cut spending to reasonable levels, mainly through discretionary and defense spending cuts, maybe by limiting some benefits, and we're going to raise taxes to a reasonable amount, and we're going to try to get those things lined up over the long term, right? For example, the Solutions 2 initiative, which is a really good one, even gives like a menu of different tax and spending options. So if you think, well, we don't want to cut spending too much for the poor, it says, okay, well then here's what you'd have to do to raise taxes. It has like a lot of different choices that you can take. The bottom line is all of these choices, just as a matter of math, provide a way to avoid the debt to GDP ratio rising to this 152% that the CBO is projecting in 2048. And the pro is going to say, this is what we have to do. And critically, what it's going to say is we have to do it now, right? And here's why we have to do it now. Because every day we wait and every dollar we spend, it's going to get harder. Every percentage we add to the debt to GDP ratio is one more problem we're going to have to address. Every day we wait is one day closer we get to this nightmare scenario. It's going to have to happen eventually because it's just, again, a matter of math. If we keep spending more than we bring in good times and in bad times, we're going to get to a point where we have so much debt that we see interest rates rise and we see our interest payments being too high and we have these catastrophic situations. And by the way, there's never going to be a better time than right now economically because we have a very strong economy right now, historically speaking. So now is the best time to do it. Other countries are realizing this. This is a chart that comes from the IMF, and you may see the con argue that lots of other countries have high debts, but what this chart shows you is in the last few years, right, these countries have gotten themselves on a policy course to begin reducing their debt to GDP ratio. Almost every other country, every other major developed country in the world is seeing that this is a problem and is putting on the brakes and is getting on track to reduce these things. Because, right, if something can't go on forever, then it won't, like we said earlier. And it's sort of like the Titanic cruising toward that iceberg. If the Titanic had known the iceberg was out there hours and hours beforehand, it could have changed its course a couple of degrees and avoided the iceberg. But the closer and closer and closer you get, the more dramatic a turn you're going to have to make, the harder it's going to be to turn the ship. In the case of the economy, the more debt you're going to have, the less money you're going to have to spend in the budget to fix the problem, right? The less money you're going to have to stimulate the economy because you're spending so much of it on interest, right? So the best time to turn the ship is right now. It's only going to get harder the farther and farther and farther along we go. So now is the time that we have to do it, because it's just something that absolutely has to happen. And in the future, you're only going to have more pain. So whatever downsides the con argues about cutting spending and raising taxes, you can say, we agree, those things are bad. But if we wait 20 years, we're just going to have to cut spending and raise taxes even more, right? To avoid this scenario, right? So that's the basic story that you tell, right? There's a catastrophe out there. It must be addressed or it will end very badly. And now is the best time to do it, because if we wait, the challenges will only be magnified until the point they become impossible. Now, there are a few other things that the pro can say beyond this basic story. So let me add a couple others, and we'll drop links to these and put some notes about them down below. But another interesting point that the pro can make is that really there's not a whole lot of room to raise growth, but there's a lot of room to do better on debt to GDP. For example, growth right now in this country is around 3%, which is, historically speaking, very high. If it goes much higher than that, we worry about the economy overheating, we worry about inflation. It's very rare to see sustained growth above 3%. So one argument the pro can make simply is, how are you going to emphasize economic growth above this very healthy level of growth that we have right now? There's just not a lot of room to do that. You certainly can't do it over long periods of time. You're not going to see 4 and 5% growth over long periods of time. It just doesn't happen. But on the other hand, there's tons of room to fix the debt to GDP ratio. That's as high as it's ever been. The growth of the debt to GDP ratio is really fast by historical standards. There's tons of room to slow that down. So one intuitive argument the pro can make is there's very little room to prioritize economic growth in a healthy economy. There's tons of room to prioritize reducing debt to GDP ratio. So just as a matter of common sense, you want to go for the area where there's a lot of room to do better, as opposed to the area where we're already arguably doing about as well as we possibly can, right? The next thing is, and I think this is super important, this is just another kind of little wrinkle that will give your opponent something to talk about, which is debt as a threat to the national security, right? I don't usually quote the Bible, but according to the King James Bible, Proverbs 22:7, the debtor is slave to the lender, right? When you owe people money, you don't have the ability to challenge their behavior as easily, right? And there are some pretty good sources on this idea that the more we owe, particularly internationally, but overall, the harder it is for us to pursue our national security objectives. The Brookings Institution has a good article on this, and there are numerous others. But basically, when you spend hundreds of billions of dollars paying on interest, that's just less money that you can spend on the military in a crisis situation or in a war. It also undercuts our credibility and soft power. If we're seen as the state that's constantly dependent on borrowing with this rapidly rising debt to GDP ratio, especially while all these other countries have the prudence and the wisdom to start lowering theirs, we're going to lose our credibility internationally, our soft power that lets us accomplish things without going to war in the first place, and that's bad. And finally, just like if you owe the banker a lot of money on your student loan, you're probably not going to go call the banker out on their bad behavior in their personal life. Well, similarly, if we continue to owe more and more and more in billions and trillions of dollars to other countries like China, we're going to be more reluctant to call them out on their bad behavior internationally, right? Again, the debtor is slave to the lender, right? So this national security angle is pretty good. You can make it a pretty short, quick contention that's going to add a whole nother thing that the con has to address. I think it's a good sort of secondary argument. I'd probably throw it in, even if you're not going to focus on it, maybe at the end of the case. I think it's a nice option. Last thing I have, and we'll put a few other things in the notes, but the last major thing I want to talk about is the idea of a moral responsibility to future generations. Actually, I have two things. Let me do this one first. Moral responsibility to future generations is important. Basically, the national debt is the only form of debt that can be transferred from one generation to the other without consent. Like if your parents die and owe the bank a lot of money, well, the bank's just out of luck. They can't come after you and the money you make in your job. But because the federal debt belongs to the nation, which never dies, you will pick up the tab for the money your parents are currently borrowing through their government, right? And that's what's called a moral hazard issue in economic terms. If I go into a store with my own credit card, even though I'm not paying the money right then, I'm going to be reasonably careful, right? Because I know I'm going to have to pay it out of my own money eventually. But if I go into a store with your credit card, you're my son or my daughter or my nephew, and I go in with your credit card, well, Katie barred the door, I'm just going to spend whatever because I don't have to pay for it, right? And that moral hazard of spending money on stuff now, knowing that we'll never really have to pay for it, this debt will eventually be inherited by you. Also, there's the intuitive argument that you didn't consent to this. You're not old enough to vote, right? I mean, you could say, we, as this team, we don't want you, adults, ruining our future with all of this debt, and of course, there might be times where we have to take on debts like wars and recessions, but that's not what we're doing. We're just spending like crazy, even during good economic times, because your parents want to have all these social programs and all these low taxes, and later on, you're going to have fewer programs and higher taxes to pay for their sort of excess. And that is a gut level intuitive argument that has some good sources that we'll put down in the notes. It has a lot of intuitive value if you're looking for something to really kind of hit a lay judge kind of in the gut with a little bit to get away from some of these numbers. And then lastly, there's a sort of progressive distribution argument, which is that economic growth mainly benefits the rich, but avoiding the economic collapse like Greece saw is going to mainly help the poor. So when we see economic growth, what we see, really good studies in the last few years have shown us, for example, that all this huge economic growth we've seen since the 1970s has seen the incomes for the 1% triple, while working class families saw their purchasing power fall by 7%. So economic growth mainly benefits the rich in terms of their purchasing power, really doesn't help the working class and the poor. But preventing an economic collapse like in Greece is going to definitely help the least advantaged, because remember what they had to do when they saw their debt collapse. They had to cut public sector jobs, which belong to working class folks. They had to cut pensions. They had to raise taxes, yes, but they raise taxes on everyone, right? The most vulnerable in society are the ones that are going to be hurt if we see these collapses and have to do austerity measures. So as between prioritizing economic growth, which mainly helps the rich, and avoiding this catastrophe where we have to cut government benefits and public sector pay and all of these things, we should prioritize the latter because it helps those who are most in need. Right. So those are some good options, I think, for how the pro can come at this. We'll try to put more in the notes below, but I think there are a lot of good options. Just remember, as I tell my own team here at MSU, this is one where you can't get too bogged down on the data and the economics. You've got to know it, right? But you absolutely have to tell a compelling story that the judge can follow and understand. And if you do, you'll be in a much better position. So with that, let's move on and talk about how the con can tell its story and how they can be in a strong position on this topic. All right, so we've spent a lot of time talking about the pro because frankly, the pro has a little bit more of an uphill battle, but now it's time for the con. Let's talk about what the strategy is going to be to win when you're on the con here. And the basic idea is you're also going to tell a simple story, and the story goes like this. The sky is not falling. The debt is not a catastrophe. It may sound like a lot, but then again, the United States economy sounds like a lot. We're always talking about trillions of dollars when we talk about the global economy and the U.S. economy. The fact is that trying to reduce the debt would be a solution that is far worse than the problem that it seeks to solve. So let's not be henny penny and scream that the sky is falling and go out and do something that would make whatever problems exist much, much worse, right? That's the story you're telling. The other thing is the con you want to keep in mind as a general theme is that you want to be the sort of side that is reasonable, right? You want to say, look, we don't necessarily have a problem with, in the long run, looking at constraining the rate of growth of the debt or constraining the growth of the debt to GDP ratio. We're okay with that. What we're talking about here is reducing the debt, right? We're literally reducing the dollar amount of the debt. That's what the word reducing means. And you basically box the pro in and make them defend reducing the dollar amount, and then you just hit them with all your evidence and ammunition about why that would require austerity. austerity, why that would require massive spending cuts, and why it would basically be disastrous for the economy. And that's the basic story that you tell. And if you get them to that point, you've got a real advantage. 4 basic angles, I guess you could think of these as contentions, just sort of strategies, I guess, that we're going to talk about. First is that the debt is not a major problem. That's something we really need to address that we haven't yet. The second is, even if you think it's a problem, reducing it by cutting the actual dollar amount would be disastrous and make things much worse. Third, you can't prioritize debt reduction over growing the economy because you have to do both at the same time. They go hand in hand, and trying to prioritize reduction doesn't work. And finally, the timing is all wrong because we're about to go into a recession, and now would be the worst possible time to prioritize spending cuts and debt reduction. This is when we need to be growing the economy and spending. So let's start with the debt is not a major problem. And like we said earlier, the way you know if debt is a problem is mainly to look at the interest rates. Right? When your creditors think that you have too much debt, right? When they think that you've taken on too much debt and you might not be able to repay it, they're going to charge you a higher interest rate. But the United States interest rates are still historically at very low levels, right? The rate on a 5-year treasury right now is 2.5%. That's very low compared to many countries in the world. We're a little bit higher than a few, lower than many, lower than where we've been historically for the most part. So it's a very, very low interest rate. And that's because we make our payments. We make them on time. Our creditors are smart. They know that we're the biggest, strongest, most secure economy in a country in the world, and that there's really nobody else that's going to give them a more secure, steady deal. So our interest rates are low because we can make these payments. We've got this. We're good for it. Our creditors know that. And this is actually a really important response to what I think a common pro argument will be. There's a source out there from the World Bank that I've seen cited a lot that talks about how there's this 77% debt to GDP ratio, and if you pass it, you start seeing your economy slow down. And it's a commonly cited statistic. The problem is that that study assumes that after you pass the 77% threshold, which we've passed, we're at 105% or so, that something is going to happen. Namely, your creditors are going to raise interest rates. They're going to demand higher interest rates. And guess what? That just hasn't happened. So the mechanism by which this slowdown would happen with a 77% debt to GDP ratio that pro teams are probably going to cite, right, has not happened. We have not seen our interest rates go up significantly, right? It just empirically hasn't happened. And so if you get hit with that source, the response would be yes, but the way that the economy would be slowed down is for interest rates to go up, and they haven't because we're the biggest, strongest, safest investment in the world because we're the United States. The other way that an economy could be slowed down by debt is if we raise taxes, but guess what? We haven't raised taxes. You could raise them to pay down the debt, but we haven't done that. So really, we're not doing anything to slow down the economy, and empirically, the economy currently and recently has been in good shape. And it's interesting that every single one, or it seems like every single one of these articles you read about why the debt is such a threat, talks about someday in the future, at some hypothetical point, the debt will become a major drain on the economy. And right, of course, with anything, with any expenditure, if it kept growing forever unchecked, yes, of course it would be a problem. But, it's interesting. You might want to ask the pro, can you cite a single economist that says today, right now, in the world we live in right now, with the debt level we have right now, that it's actually draining the economy and not this 77% statistic because, interest rates are not going up? Because the resolution says we have to lower it today. So is there any evidence that it's actually harming the U.S. economy today? And it seems like the answer to that is no, right? So that's a reasonable question to ask. The other thing you can do to show that it's really not that big a problem is put it in context. Our debt is very similar to developed peer countries. The UK at 90%, Canada is about 90%, France is 98%. Put it in the context of household debts in the United States. If you look at census data from 2017, the average U.S. household makes about $59,000 but has $137,000 in debt. So their debt to income ratio, which would be their debt to GDP ratio, is about 220%. Do we worry that the average household in the United States is going to go bankrupt? Well, they don't. The average household does not go bankrupt. If you look at it in the context of national net worth, usually the way we compare our debts is not to our annual income or our GDP. The smart way to do it would be compare it to our our overall net worth. How much are we worth as a country? Well, our net worth in this country is $123 trillion, with $269 trillion in assets and $145 trillion in debts. So our federal debt of $21 trillion is only 8%, right? Only about 8% of our total assets. And that's really not an astronomical amount of money, right? So overall, the debt isn't slowing down the economy. There's no evidence that it is. The economy's doing just fine. And so if you want to reduce it, then, there's no reason to do that. Now, the second thing is, and this is the sort of second point to make, even if you are worried about debt, even if you think that these big trillion-dollar numbers are bad, reducing the debt is an even worse solution, right? Because it requires austerity. So first, right, as we said earlier, you as the con need to win this argument that reducing means lowering the dollar amount below 21 trillion, which is the current level, right? The Oxford English Dictionary defines reducing as to make smaller or less in amount, degree, or size. So you just say, look, that's what reducing is. And then you have to explain to the judge that to lower the debt by even $1, right, we would have to wipe out the deficit, because the deficit is the shortfall we have in any given year. And as long as you have a deficit, that's adding to the debt. You can't reduce the debt until the deficit is gone. The problem is that OMB, right, is projecting a $1 trillion deficit for 2019. So to get rid of that, to prioritize reducing that, we're going to have a balanced budget for 2019, which means we're going to have to find some way of getting rid of $1 trillion in spending, right? And we know, as we talked about earlier, that even if you implement some of the most progressive tax strategies out there and tax people more and tax the rich more, you're still probably only going to generate maybe a few $100 billion, right, in new revenue. So where are you going to get that $700 or $800 billion in budget cuts? Like, how are you going to do that, Pro? If you want to reduce the deficit, you're going to have to balance the budget. Excuse me, if you want to reduce the debt, you're going to have to get rid of the annual deficit, because you can't reduce a debt while you're still taking on more debt, right? So how are you going to do that? Okay, you raise taxes, you generate a few $100 billion more. You're still going to have to get rid of 800, 700, something like that, $1 billion in spending. Are you going to cut all military spending? That's $599 billion, or all Medicare, or maybe all transportation, education, and veterans benefits? I would literally ask the Pro, how are you going to do this? What are you going to cut? And if you can't tell us what you're going to cut, how in the world can the judge vote for you, right? But even if you could make all these cuts, the outcome would be disastrous. Economist William Black said that a balanced budget, this austerity that you'd have to do to reduce the debt, would be like shooting the economy in the head, right? And it's impossible to say what the actual impact of a balanced budget or austerity would be for sure looking forward. But if we look back to the recession of 2008, economists looked at that and they concluded, and I'm going to put the sources down in the notes below, but they said if we'd had to balance the budget then, if we'd had to reduce the debt then, we would have seen the economy shrink by an astounding 22% as opposed to the 8% that it actually shrank, right? We would have tripled the negative impact of that recession. We would have seen unemployment rise to 19%, which is more than double the 9% that it actually reached. The Center for Budget and Policy Priorities in 2018 pointed to research indicating that balancing the budget, which again is a prerequisite to reducing the debt, would throw 15 million new people out of work. And then, to make matters worse than that, right, when those people are out of work, demand for social programs like SNAP, which is basically food stamps, unemployment benefits, Medicaid, these are all going to go up, right? The problem is you're not going to be able to expand these programs. You may not even be able to fund these programs because, remember, you're having to cut spending to balance the budget. So it would be this horrible impact on unemployment, horrible impact on the growth of the economy. The worst impacts would be on the poor because they would be put out of work and you wouldn't be able to fund the programs that they need, right? And then ultimately, the nightmare scenario is what Greece had, which we talked about earlier with the Pro. The Pro used Greece as sort of a long-term thing if we don't reduce the debt. But if you win the definitions fight, right, if you show that reducing means we have to do it now, then basically you'd have to do what Greece did now. You'd have to make major cuts, major tax increases, and Greece saw its GDP cut, completely in half despite all of these things that it did. So that's the story you're going to tell, which is that lowering the debt requires austerity, it requires a balanced budget, and that would have a catastrophic effect on the economy. So the choice you have, Judge, is between a debt that sounds like a lot, that's just not hurting the economy currently. We can make these payments. We're good for it. We're a very strong economy. Or doing this austerity that's going to completely wreck the economy, put 15 million people out of work, drive the GDP down by 22%, just basically a nightmare scenario, and there's no reason to do it. And then on top of that, the last thing you would say, I think, would be, look, Judge, we're not unreasonable, okay? We're not crazy. We know that, at some point in the infinite future, if debts grow forever, yes, it would be a problem. We're not saying that we can't gradually slow the rate of growth on the debt, but what the resolution says is reduce. And what the pro has to advocate is reducing this number of 21 trillion. We're okay with slowing its growth. We just don't want to put on the brakes, slam on the brakes right now and do this disastrous impact on the economy, right? The third thing that I would be talking about if I were on the con is that you really can't prioritize debt reduction over economic growth. You have to do both at the same time. The least painful way, really the only way to control the debt, right, isn't to stop it here and scale it back in absolute dollar terms. Rather, it's to maybe slow its growth to some extent, but then grow the economy so the economy catches up, or at least stays a reasonable distance behind the debt. And this is not according to me. This is according to really well-regarded analysts and economists like Alice Rivlin of the Brookings Institution and economist Carmen Reinhart of Harvard, which we'll put in the sources below. But basically, if you get a jacket that's too big and you're a kid and you're still growing, you don't take the scissors and try to do alterations on the jacket. You just wait until you grow into the jacket, right? Growth is the engine that gives us more revenue to spend. And it's the engine that grows the private sector and creates jobs so that fewer people need government benefits and fewer people need help from the government, right? You've got to have growth to have any hope whatsoever of balancing the budget, because without it, you have less revenue to spend and more people who need government revenue, right? Government help. Saying you're going to prioritize debt over growth is like saying, I'm going to prioritize getting into a good college over getting good grades. Well, I'm sorry, but getting good grades is a prerequisite to getting into a good college. And having economic growth, sustained economic growth, is a prerequisite to reducing the debt. And these economists are basically telling you, you've got to do both at the same time. This is a nice, nuanced argument, I think, that the con can use to stake out the reasonableness standard. We're not extremists. We don't think the debt can go on forever. We just think that you've got to do both at the same time. You can't be draconian and basically try to scale it back completely, right? And then the last thing I think the con needs to be talking about is that, and this is an interesting sort of little wrinkle to the argument, is you've already missed the window to do this. If you agree, if we believe that the word prioritize has something to do with like when we do it, like how soon do we do this? What's the time frame? You've already missed the window, right? A lot of pros may be running evidence saying the economy is good right now. It's strong. So now is the time we need to go ahead and reduce the debt. The problem is that would have been a good argument 2 or 3 years ago. It's not a good argument now because analysts right now, and this is going to rely on very current evidence. This is the kind of thing where you might do a Google search the day before the tournament and find like the most current source on this, right? But analysts today are saying we're about to start looking at the very end of the upswing cycle, of the growth cycle of the economy. We're about to start looking at a recession. Economies run in cycles. They go up, they go down, they go up, they go down, right? And many analysts, Forbes, Bloomberg, many, private capital companies, they're releasing end of the year analysis. And a lot of them are saying, basically all of them are saying, there are strong signs we're about to head into a recession. Well, as we talked about earlier, John Maynard Keynes would tell you that a recession is the worst time to try to cut the debt. That's when you need to be spending more money on government programs to stimulate the economy to get it growing again, right? That's when you need to not be raising taxes. You need to leave the money in the private economy to let it grow. So Keynes would tell us that that's what we need to do. That's what we did in the 2008 recession, right? We spent a lot of money. We added a pretty good bit of debt to the national debt, and it got us out of that recession. So this is kind of a fun little separate argument where you can say, look, Judge, even if as a general matter you believe overall reducing the debt is more important than growing the economy, right now we are just at the very tail end of our growth cycle. We're about to step off into recession territory now, and if we changed policy now, it would start being felt, a year from now when we are well and truly into a recession, right? Now would be the worst possible time for us to start emphasizing debt reduction over economic growth. We need to get through the coming recession, which involves spending. It involves getting money out there flowing and getting the economy going. And then when we get out of it a few years down the road, then maybe we can talk about doing debt reduction. And this does its own separate work. Like, even if you lose all of the arguments about why, debt is good or bad generally, why growth is good or bad generally, you can say as a sort of separate thing, now is not the time. And number one, that could win the round for you. But number two, at minimum, if your opponent is smart, they're going to spend waste like a lot of time addressing that, because it's its own separate avenue of offense. It's not dependent on any of the other stuff that we've talked about. You just have to argue that spending is important. So that's basically it. Those are the four sort of things I would be looking at if I were running a case on the negative. Again, I think the negative has the sort of natural high ground. If you win that reducing means take it down below 21 trillion, you basically have a ton of great evidence that's going to be that you would have to engage in austerity. You would have to dramatically slow the economy down, raise taxes in a way that would be, basically catastrophic, as long as you win that definition. So with that, we will finish up the con and move to some final thoughts. Okay, and that's it. So I know this video ran a little bit long. Sorry about that. Thanks for sticking with us. Just remember very briefly that this is a resolution that gets super complicated. People can talk past each other. That's why it's really important to understand the definition fight we talked about earlier, to go in and win the framework, to seize that reasonable middle ground, right? Once you have that middle ground, it becomes a matter of telling a straightforward story. The story on the pro is this has to happen eventually as a matter of math. It's never going to be easier or less painful to do it than right now. It's only going to get harder to turn the ship the closer we get to the iceberg. So it's time to go ahead and start correcting the problem of debt to GDP ratio. The con's basic story is this is not a catastrophe. It's not a huge problem. The only way you're going to create a catastrophe is if you go in and actually try to reduce the debt, right? That's going to create the economic catastrophe. There's no reason to do that. Things are okay. The sky is not falling. All right. So again, thanks so much for taking the time with us. We always want to be helpful if we can. If there's something we can clarify, something you think we could do better, drop it in the comments below. As always, everything you need in terms of the timestamps and the sources is going to be in the notes. Wishing you a fantastic January, a fantastic 2019 as you head out to compete. And remember, as always, work hard, have fun, and Hail State.